A man jogging across an empty hospital parking lot at 9:40 at night, running late for a shift that started in 4 minutes. Within 90 seconds, he would be on the ground, convulsing from 50,000 volts, his surgical scrubs soaked through with sweat and pavement grime, while a security officer stood over him insisting he matched the description of a trespasser. This is the story of an excessive force lawsuit that shook a hospital system to its core, a $2.9 million settlement, and the night one officer's twitchy trigger finger nearly cost an entire surgical unit its most skilled hands. Dr. Andre Whitaker was 39 years old and one of the most sought-after orthopedic trauma surgeons in the entire metropolitan hospital network. He had completed his residency at one of the top programs in the country, specialized further in complex limb reconstruction, and built a reputation over a decade that meant other surgeons routinely called him in for the cases nobody else wanted to attempt. Shattered pelvises, mangled limbs, the kind of injuries where a single misjudged decision meant the difference between a patient walking again and losing a leg entirely. Younger residents in the program often described him as the surgeon they hoped to become, not just for his technical skill but for the way he stayed in a patient's room long after rounds had officially ended, answering questions other attendings would have delegated to a nurse. He worked nights more often than most of his colleagues by choice, not necessity, because the trauma cases that came through the ER after dark tended to be the ones that needed him most. Car accidents, industrial injuries, gunshot wounds, and he had long ago decided that being available for those moments mattered more to him than a conventional schedule. He kept a small apartment within walking distance of the hospital specifically so he could be on site within minutes if a critical case came through unexpectedly. A habit that had more than once made the difference for a patient whose injuries couldn't wait for an on-call surgeon to drive across town. That night, like most nights, he left his apartment in scrubs already, planning to swing by his car to grab a jacket before heading inside, running slightly behind after a longer-than-expected phone call with a patient's anxious family who'd needed reassurance ahead of a surgery scheduled for the following morning. He promised the family he'd personally check on their father one more time before the procedure, a small gesture that meant a great deal to them, and meant he was now jogging across the lot instead of walking, the last few seconds of an ordinary night about to become anything but ordinary. The hospital's east parking structure had been the site of an attempted break-in 3 nights earlier, an incident involving someone trying to pry open car windows in the dim, poorly lit far corner of the lot. Hospital security had been put on heightened alert since, with explicit instructions to stop and question anyone moving quickly through the structure after dark, particularly anyone who appeared to be approaching vehicles rather than the hospital entrance itself. Andre, badge clicked loosely to his scrub top, but flapping against his chest as he jogged, cut diagonally across the lot toward his car. Exactly the kind of fast, purposeful movement the alert had warned officers to watch for. Security Officer Dale Pruitt, a contracted guard with 8 months on the job and a noted tendency toward overcorrection after being reprimanded for missing the original break-in attempt entirely, spotted him from across the structure and immediately began moving to intercept. "Hey, stop right there!" Pruitt shouted, already unclipping the taser from his belt as he closed the distance of a near run, his breathing already ragged with adrenaline before he'd even reached speaking distance. Andre slowed, confused, raising both hands instinctively at the sudden aggression in the officer's voice. "I work here. I'm just grabbing my jacket from my car. I've got a shift starting. I said stop moving." Pruitt's voice cracked with adrenaline, his hand already raising the taser into firing position despite Andre having come to a complete stop several feet away. "I am stopped," Andre said, keeping his voice level despite the alarm rising in his chest, hands still raised, badge still visible against his scrubs if anyone had bothered to look. "My name is Dr. Whitaker. I'm an orthopedic surgeon here. My shift starts in 4 minutes. I really need to—" "Don't move toward that vehicle," Pruitt barked, cutting him off entirely, clearly not processing a single word Andre had said. His eyes were locked not on Andre's face or the badge clicked to his chest, but somewhere lower, scanning his hands, his waistband, the kind of fixated tunnel vision that came from a mind already convinced of what it was about to find. Andre felt something shift in his chest, Not quite fear yet, but the particular familiar unease of recognizing that reason wasn't going to be enough to diffuse whatever was building in front of him. He'd felt it before, years earlier, during a traffic stop that had ended without incident, only because the officer that night had happened to be more patient than this one appeared to be. "I'm not moving toward anything, I'm standing still," Andre said, frustration beginning to creep into his otherwise controlled voice. "Officer, please, just look at my badge. It's right here on my chest." Pruitt didn't look, whether out of genuine panic, tunnel vision, or something closer to the assumption he'd already formed the moment he saw a black man moving quickly through a dark parking structure. He never gave himself the half-second it would have taken to actually read the laminated card clipped to Andre's scrub top. "Get on the ground," Pruitt shouted, voice cracking entirely now, his finger tightening on the trigger of the taser, even as the distance between them remained well within range for a calm verbal resolution. "I haven't done anything. I'm a doctor at this hospital. Please just—" Andre's voice rose slightly now, not in defiance, but in the specific, urgent tone of a man trying to communicate clearly before something irreversible happened. The same tone he sometimes used in a trauma bay when a junior resident was about to make a critical mistake. The taser fired before Andre finished the sentence. 2 metal probes struck his chest and abdomen, and 50,000 volts of electricity tore through his nervous system, dropping him instantly to the cold concrete, his body seizing involuntarily as a strangled involuntary cry tore out of him. His head struck the pavement on the way down, opening a shallow gash above his eyebrow that would later require 4 stitches. For several seconds, the only sound in the structure was the buzzing crackle of the taser's current, and the wet, ragged gasp of a man who, hours earlier, had been the steadiest set of hands in an entire surgical wing. Pruitt stood over him, breathing hard, radioing for backup with a kind of clipped urgency reserved for genuine threats. Subject down, possible trespasser near the vehicles in the east structure, requesting additional units. Andre lay on the ground, muscles still twitching involuntarily from the residual current, blood trickling from his eyebrow into the corner of his eye. His badge, still clipped to his chest the entire time, now smeared faintly with blood and grit. The pain was almost secondary to the disorientation. His mind still partially trapped in the rhythm of the phone call he'd been on minutes earlier, struggling to reconcile the gentle reassurance he'd just offered a worried family with the violent jolt that had just torn through his entire body. 2 more security officers arrived within 90 seconds, and it was one of them, an older guard named Felix Ortiz, who had worked at the hospital for over a decade and recognized Andre immediately despite the blood and the dazed expression, who froze mid-stride. Pruitt, that's Dr. Whitaker." "What?" Pruitt's confidence cracked instantly, the taser still loosely held at his side, his entire posture shifting from authoritative to uncertain in the span of a single word. "That's Dr. Andre Whitaker. He's an attending surgeon. He's been here for years. I see him every single shift." Ortiz was already crouching beside Andre, helping him sit up, his voice shifting from professional alarm to something closer to genuine horror. "Doc, are you okay? Can you hear me? Talk to me, Doc." Ortiz had personally waved Andre through this same parking structure hundreds of times over the years, had exchanged small talk with him about the Bulls' playoff chances and his daughter's college applications, and the dissonance of seeing him now, bleeding on the concrete with taser probes still embedded in his scrub top, hit him with a force that briefly left him unable to speak further. Andre, still disoriented, managed a single sentence that would later be quoted in nearly every news article covering the case. "My shift started 2 minutes ago. I need someone to call the OR and tell them I'm going to be late." He refused transport to the ER initially, insisting on being seen by hospital staff he trusted rather than treated as a patient in the same emergency department he worked alongside daily, though the attending physician on duty that night firmly overruled him after seeing the laceration and confirming he'd need stitches and a full neurological evaluation given the head impact. The attending, a younger colleague who had trained under Andre during her own residency years earlier, knelt beside the gurney and said quietly, "You tell any patient of yours the same thing right now, Andre. Let me do my job." Word moved through the hospital with the speed unique to institutions where everyone knows everyone. Nurses who had worked alongside Andre for years began texting each other within minutes of the incident, the news spreading from the ER to the surgical floor to administration faster than any official channel could have managed. Fragments of the story shifting slightly with each retelling, but always landing on the same disbelieving core. Someone had tased Dr. Whitaker in the parking lot. By the time the hospital's chief of surgery arrived 20 minutes later, summoned directly by a panicked call from the ER charge nurse, the story had already reached the hospital's CEO, who in turn had already placed a call to the chair of the hospital's governing board. "I want to know exactly how this happened," the chief of surgery said, standing over Andre's gurney in the ER, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "And I want to know why a man wearing this hospital's own ID badge was tased in our own parking structure." The hospital's board of directors convened an emergency session the following morning, a session that, unusually, included Andre himself, still wearing a small bandage above his eyebrow, invited specifically to give his own account before any official statement was drafted. The board chair, a retired federal judge who had joined the hospital's governance structure after retirement specifically because of her background in civil rights litigation, asked pointed questions that made clear this would not be handled as a routine incident report. "Dr. Whitaker, I want to be direct with you," she said. "This hospital employs you because you are one of the most skilled surgeons in this network. The idea that our own security contractor tased you in our own parking lot, badge visible, while you were trying to get to your shift on time is not something this board intends to quietly absorb." Andre, still processing the physical and emotional aftershocks of the previous night, chose his words with the same careful precision he applied to every difficult conversation with a patient's family. "I don't want a press conference. I don't want this to become a spectacle. What I want is for this to never happen to anyone else who walks through that lot, staff, patient, visitor, doesn't matter who they are. I want to understand exactly how a man with a weapon capable of seriously hurting someone ended up with so little training that he couldn't tell the difference between a threat and a doctor running 4 minutes late." The board chair nodded slowly, making a note on the legal pad in front of her. "That's exactly the question we intend to answer." Andre's attorney, retained within hours of the incident, began compiling the case with methodical precision. Surveillance footage from 3 separate angles covering the parking structure, Pruitt's full incident report, and the security contractor's training records, which would later reveal Pruitt had received only 4 hours of taser certification training, well below the contractor's own stated minimum standard of 16 hours required for armed deployment in a healthcare setting. The discrepancy alone, once uncovered, became one of the most damaging pieces of evidence in the entire case, suggesting the contractor itself had known its own standards weren't being met and had simply chosen not to enforce them. Within the first week, news of the incident had spread well beyond the hospital's own walls. A local medical association issued a statement expressing alarm, and several other hospitals in the region quietly began reviewing their own security contractors' training requirements, unwilling to find themselves explaining a similar incident to their own boards in the months ahead. The investigation that followed exposed problems well beyond Pruitt's individual judgment. It became clear, as the hospital's legal team and an outside compliance auditor dug further, that the security contractor had a documented history of shortcuts in its training pipeline, cutting corners on certification hours in order to keep new hires staffed and billable as quickly as possible, a pattern that had apparently gone unchecked by the hospital's own procurement office for years. Surveillance footage, reviewed frame by the hospital's legal team, showed clearly that Andre had come to a complete stop, with hands raised a full 3 seconds before Pruitt fired, and that his hospital badge had remained visible and unobstructed throughout the entire encounter. The footage also captured something the initial incident report had conveniently omitted. Pruitt had drawn the taser nearly 15 seconds before reaching Andre, well before any words had even been exchanged between them, suggesting the decision to use force had been made almost the instant Pruitt spotted him moving through the lot. In his deposition, Pruitt attempted to argue that the dim lighting in the structure made the badge difficult to see, and that Andre's quick movements toward the vehicle row matched the profile of the suspected break-in offender from days earlier. The hospital's attorney calmly produced lighting specifications for the structure, confirming illumination levels well within standard visibility range, along with time-stamped footage proving Andre had been completely stationary for the 3 seconds preceding the taser deployment. Mr. Pruitt, the attorney said, you fired a weapon capable of causing serious injury at a man who was standing still, hands raised, after he told you his name and his occupation. What, specifically, in those 3 seconds, made you conclude that deploying that weapon was necessary? I panicked, Pruitt admitted eventually, his earlier composure giving way under the weight of footage that left no room for alternative explanation. After the break-in last week, I reacted. Pruitt's answer, that he had simply reacted, would become a central exhibit in the case, cited repeatedly as evidence that the contractor's minimal training standards had produced an officer fundamentally unprepared for the judgment his role required, a man given a weapon capable of serious harm without ever being adequately trained necessary to wield it responsibly. The hospital terminated its contract with the security firm entirely within a month, citing the inadequate training standards exposed during the investigation, and brought parking structure security in-house under direct hospital management with a substantially expanded training program developed in consultation with use of force experts. The new program included mandatory de-escalation certification, quarterly recertification, and a strict requirement that any officer encountering a hospital employee verify identification before any physical intervention beyond verbal commands. Pruitt was terminated from the security contractor and, following a state licensing review, had his security officer certification permanently revoked, the review board's decision noting his demonstrated inability to exercise the judgment required for armed security work in a healthcare environment. The hospital settled with Dr. Whitaker for $2.9 million, a figure the board chair insisted on making public specifically to demonstrate the institution's commitment to transparency rather than quiet resolution. She had argued forcefully in the board's closed session that a sealed settlement would only confirm to the public exactly what they already suspected, that institutions protected themselves first and their people second, and she wasn't willing to let that be the hospital's legacy in this case. Andre donated a significant portion of the settlement to fund a mentorship program for medical students of color, pursuing surgical specialties, a field where representation remains stubbornly low despite decades of stated institutional commitment to change. The program paired first-year medical students with practicing surgeons for shadowing, research opportunities, and the kind of informal guidance that so often determined whether a promising student actually made it through the brutal attrition of surgical training. Andre personally mentored the program's first cohort of 6 students himself, making time for it even during his busiest on-call weeks. Andre returned to the OHA 5 days after the incident, against the advice of several colleagues who suggested he take additional time. He performed a complex limb reconstruction that afternoon on a patient who had been waiting weeks for a surgeon with his specific expertise. The same steady hands that had been seized by electricity days earlier, now working with their usual precision. The surgical team around him noting, quietly, that his focus in the OR seemed entirely unshaken despite everything. He still works nights more often than not, still parks in the same structure, though the badge clicked to his scrubs these days sits a little higher, a little more visible. A small, quiet adjustment he never fully explained to anyone who asked. Felix Ortiz, the security guard who had recognized him that night, still waves him through the same lot most evenings, and the two of them have developed an easy, familiar nod between them that neither has needed to put into words. This story is a reminder that competence and credentials offer no protection against a snap judgment formed in half a second, and that the difference between safety and catastrophe for so many people comes down entirely to whether the person holding power over that moment chooses to look closely enough to actually see them. It is a lesson institutions rarely learn until the cost becomes impossible to ignore, and one this hospital, at least, finally chose to act on rather than bury. If this story made your blood boil, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe for more true stories of justice finally catching up.